I read a disturbing story this week about an old boys club with one powerful man in charge. He was prone to inappropriate behavior, especially towards women. He demeaned them, he commented on their bodies, he demanded that they perform sexual acts for him. And because he wielded so much power, these women said nothing. A woman would approach him with trepidation, knowing that he held her very livelihood in his hands. And when he made these comments, she was left powerless, silenced. The people around him did nothing. Maybe they made a comment here or there telling him that his behavior was out of bounds, but mostly they enabled him or just looked the other way. They said, that's just part of his shtick. And then one brave woman spoke up. Knowing it might cost her everything, she refused his inappropriate advance. Did it change anything? No, not right away. But her story led to another, enabling at least one other woman to find her voice, and soon enough they took back some of the power that this man had stolen, some of the autonomy of which he had robbed them. I was reading the beginning of the book of Esther. It's not as funny as I remember it. The story begins with one powerful act of defiance when Vashti refuses to dance before her lecherous, drunken husband and his cronies in her bejeweled crown. The commentators say that the request implied that the crown was the only article of clothing he expected her to wear. One can hardly imagine what amount of abuse a woman like Vashti would have had to endure that this was the bridge too far. She says no to the most powerful man in her world, the man who held her life in his hands. Anyone who thinks that the king merely divorced her after that lacks the imagination of a spurned ruler with unchecked power. Which brings me to another painful story I read on Purim. Yesterday, the New York Times and ProPublica published an article about one of the most influential Jewish mega donors, who over his decades of work in the Jewish community has harassed women with sexually explicit comments. This individual has donated hundreds of millions of dollars over his career to Jewish causes, has buildings named after him, was fundamental in the creation of Birthright Israel, the free trip to Israel for young adults, and all the while he was harassing the women in his orbit. Behaving like Persia's king, he made inappropriate overtures and lewd comments to women who came to him seeking his donation to their organization and women being mentored in his fellowships. He remarked about their bodies. He solicited them to be his lovers. The comments are inappropriate to repeat in this room or in any place of business. He claims they were jokes. But his funding could make or break careers, so the women to whom he made these so-called jokes reinforced a power dynamic that devalued them. They reminded women that he had power and they had none. His friends who are interviewed in the article write off his comments as an eccentric sense of humor and a deep passion for Jewish continuity, as if it's okay to rob someone of her power as long as it's said humorously. Like the Purim story, the Times article centers on a heroine. Her name is Sheila Katz, and she is a vice president at Hillel International. She was sent to see this man in 2015 and to interview him for a video Hillel was making on Jewish philanthropists. While the camera rolled, he solicited her for an intimate relationship and called himself the King of Israel. She was disgusted, and after the incident, she reported it to her employer. She said, "No one was surprised when I shared that this had happened." Sheila was one of a few named women in the article, including my teacher, Rabbi Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi, and dozens who chose to remain anonymous but who came forward to tell their stories. But the story came together because Sheila has been carefully and strategically sharing her experience these last 4 years, trying to prevent what happened to her from happening to anyone else. Sheila also happens to be a dear friend of mine, and I have spent these last 2 days, and really the years I have known her, in awe of her courage. When the article broke yesterday, I wanted to write a tweet in support of her. A small gesture, I know, but I wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Since it was Purim, I wanted to write how she was fearless, like Esther and Vashti. But then I thought about Esther. She was far from fearless. She was terrified. She knew that she had to go before the king, but she also knew that to do so without being summoned would likely mean her death. She told her uncle that she was afraid, and then she went and saw the king nonetheless. As Cheryl Strayed writes, bravery is acknowledging your fear and doing it anyway. And was Vashti afraid? We don't know. So silenced was she by the power dynamic with the king that in the entire book of Esther, she is not given a single line of dialogue. All the text says is Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. It's easy to imagine Vashti as fearlessly standing up to the king, but she wasn't even in the same room as him. Maybe her act of defiance was more subtle, more cautious, more strategic than we depict in our Purim spiels. Vashti and Esther knew how much power this man wielded over them, but they acted anyway. Or, as Sheila wrote on Twitter yesterday, my nearly 4-year struggle to hold this prominent philanthropist accountable for his sexual harassment of me and countless other women finally came to light in the New York Times. While I am still nervous and scared of retaliation, my goal in coming forward and sharing my story is to hopefully prevent any other women in the Jewish community or beyond from having to endure any form of sexual harassment from him ever again. But how did they do this? If Vashti and Esther were afraid and they chose to do the brave thing anyway, how did they do it? How do we make it possible for the Sheila Katzes of the world to tell their stories and shine their light in dark places? If Sheila is the Esther of the story, then maybe we are her uncle Mordecai. So I went back and looked at the scene where Mordecai tries to get Esther to go before the king, and I had a realization. Mordecai is a terrible ally. Let's review the scene. When Mordecai hears of Haman's plan to kill the Jews, he goes into mourning. He's sitting outside the palace gate. Esther sends her eunuchs to go to him and find out why he is wailing. Through them, Mordecai pleads with her to go before the king and advocate on behalf of her people. Esther sends a message back saying, everyone in the kingdom knows that a person who enters the king's inner court without having been summoned is put to death. Mordecai is asking Esther to risk her life without even acknowledging the danger he's putting her in. It's easy to encourage someone to stick their neck out because it's not your neck. Her response is a subtle rebuke. Come on, uncle, everyone knows how powerful this man is, delicately implying that Mordecai knows this too. How different might this scene have gone if Mordecai had acknowledged from the beginning that he understood that Esther would have to assume the burden of risk and asked her how he could support her. The scene continues. Mordecai delivers his most famous speech. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained this royal position for just such a crisis. Powerful words, but isolating too. Look at the use of the word you. You imagine your life, if you keep silent, your house will perish. Mordecai does nothing to help Esther feel less alone, less vulnerable. Which maybe explains Esther's unexpected reply. She responds by telling her uncle to assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan to fast for 3 days on her behalf. She asks them to organize an act of solidarity. She says, I know you cannot go into the inner chamber with me in person, but I need to know that you are standing with me in spirit. This morning I asked Sheila how the last 2 days had gone. She said that the biggest relief had been the statements from various funders and organizations supporting her and the other women who came forward in the story, declaring that they will be listened to and believed. But before the article came out, she didn't know if the organized Jewish community would show up for her. She told me she didn't know whether she would be Esther, who sways the king, or Vashti, who loses her head. Esther knew what she needed. She had to know that she was not alone so that she could take the first brave step in her own salvation and the salvation of her people. God willing, we will not all need to be like Sheila. It will not be required of us to share publicly our deepest hurt or shame to make a change. And in talking to Sheila this morning, she said again and again that she only came out in the Times because she had exhausted every single more private avenue to hold this serial abuser accountable and had seen no change in 4 years. She spoke out not to shame him, but because she felt like it was the only way forward. But just like Esther, her lack of options didn't make the work any easier, any less scary. And she needed a community of people to gather around her so that she could do what she knew she needed to. We cannot all be Esther, but we must do better than Mordecai. Acknowledging how scary truth-telling can be and standing in support of the people who need to tell their stories. That fast that Esther had her uncle organize still exists today. It's an observance called Ta'anit Esther, a minor fast from sunup to sundown on the day preceding Purim. Most Reformed Jews don't observe it. In fact, if I polled this room, I'd be surprised to find more than one person who fasted this year on purpose. I know I didn't. But maybe we need to reclaim it. Kolot, the Center for Jewish Women and Gender Studies, has written that we should make Ta'anit Esther into a Jewish day for justice. In the era of #MeToo, where Purim has become a day to lift up the voices of women with powerful, painful stories to tell, then maybe the day before is a fast to remind us of what it means to be allies, of the work we have to do so that they can take the risk of coming forward. Before the celebration, before the revelry and spieling, what if we had a day to remind ourselves that we are still hungry for justice, hungry for equality, hungry for leaders with moral integrity, hungry for a world where no one is forced to endure the degradation that Vashti and Esther and Sheila went through. What does it mean to be a Jew in the era of Me Too? It means looking critically at our male heroes. Not just Mordecai, but also our mega donors, our demographic researchers, and the heads of our institutions. It means challenging the systems that they have built to maintain their own power and diminish the power of others. It means lifting up the voices of the marginalized, not just women, but Jews of color, queer Jews, converts, and those who love them. And when they are completely absent, like Vashti's, it means wrestling the text until her voice breaks through. Would that we would reach a day when no more exposés have to be written about abusive people in power, when no more women have to stand up and say, "Me too." But until that day, may it come soon. Let us observe the fast of Ta'anit Esther, the fast of those who strive to be good allies, so that the Esthers of the world know that when they stand up, they do not stand alone. Shabbat Shalom.